John Jay became the first Chief Justice of the United States in 1789, stepping into a role that was still undefined and, at the time, lacked the prestige it would later hold. The Supreme Court under Jay had no clear building, no established authority, and few cases that shaped national law. Yet Jay's leadership quietly set precedents that would endure. He believed the court's power rested not in immediate influence, but in building legitimacy over time. One of his most notable contributions was helping to define the idea of judicial independence, ensuring the court was separate from political branches. However, Jay found the early court frustratingly limited. Congress rarely referred major constitutional questions to it, and public respect for the judiciary was minimal. His work negotiating the Jay Treaty with Britain, meant to ease post-revolution tensions, brought both acclaim and fierce criticism, showing how intertwined diplomacy and law could be in a young republic. By the time he resigned in 1795 to become governor of New York, Jay had laid the groundwork for a judiciary that could one day stand alongside Congress and the presidency in influence. His tenure showed that building a court's authority is a slow process, one reliant on both legal rigor and political tact, even if much of that effort goes unrecognized in its own time.
John Rutledge's tenure as a Supreme Court justice was short and turbulent, marked by both his early contributions and his dramatic fall from the role. Appointed as an associate justice in 1789, Rutledge left the position just a year later to become Chief Justice of South Carolina's highest court. In 1795, President George Washington nominated him to return as Chief Justice of the United States, but this appointment immediately stirred political controversy. Rutledge had openly criticized the Jay Treaty, calling it a betrayal of American interests, a stance that clashed with Federalist leaders in Congress. His blunt political opinions, combined with rumors about his mental stability and health, became ammunition for opponents. When the Senate considered his appointment, the vote became the first formal rejection of a Supreme Court nominee in U.S. history. Rutledge's brief time as Chief Justice produced no landmark cases, but his story highlighted how the court was still vulnerable to political winds and personal reputation. His fall from the bench underscored the precarious nature of judicial appointments in the early republic, when political loyalty and public perception could outweigh legal skill. Rutledge's career remains a reminder that the Supreme Court's independence has always existed in tension with the political climate of its era.
William Cushing served on the Supreme Court from its inception in 1789 until 1810, making him one of the longest-serving justices of the early era. Before joining the court, Cushing had been Chief Justice of Massachusetts, where he played a pivotal role in applying the new state constitution's principles. In one notable pre-court decision, he presided over a case that effectively ended slavery in Massachusetts, interpreting the state's constitution as incompatible with the institution. As an associate justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, Cushing worked under the leadership of Chief Justice John Jay and later John Marshall, helping shape the court's foundational practices. His judicial style was methodical and deeply rooted in English common law, reflecting the legal traditions of the time while adapting them to the new American system. In 1796, George Washington nominated him to become Chief Justice after John Jay's resignation, but Cushing declined, citing health concerns and perhaps reluctance to take on the heavy administrative role. While he left behind no single groundbreaking opinion, his decades of steady service helped provide stability during the court's formative years. Cushing's quiet, consistent presence contrasted with the political drama surrounding other justices of the era, earning him a reputation as a dependable guardian of legal continuity.
James Wilson, one of the original associate justices appointed in 1789, brought with him an extraordinary political resume. He was a signer of both the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution. Born in Scotland and trained in law before emigrating to America, Wilson had been a major voice at the Constitutional Convention, advocating for a strong federal government and a judiciary with significant independence. On the Supreme Court, he participated in its earliest cases, though the court's workload in those years was relatively light. Wilson's influence extended beyond formal rulings. He delivered a series of influential lectures on law, in which he attempted to blend natural law philosophy with the principles of the new American Republic. However, despite his intellectual brilliance, his personal life was marked by turmoil. Wilson made risky land investments that collapsed, leaving him deeply in debt. His financial troubles grew so severe that he was briefly imprisoned for debt while still serving as a justice, a rare and humbling fate for someone of his stature. He died in 1798 under difficult circumstances, but his legacy as both a founding father and an early shaper of American legal thought remains strong. Wilson's vision of an energetic, authoritative judiciary would influence the court long after his passing.
John Blair, Jr., appointed to the Supreme Court in 1789 by George Washington, was one of the quieter but nonetheless significant figures among the first justices. A Virginian and a close ally of Washington, Blair had served as a delegate to the Constitutional Convention, where he played a steady, behind-the-scenes role in shaping the judiciary provisions of the Constitution. Before his time on the Supreme Court, he had been a respected judge on Virginia's highest court, known for his calm temperament and meticulous legal reasoning. On the nation's highest bench, Blair's service was largely defined by his participation in the court's earliest formative decisions, even though the docket in those years was sparse. His work helped establish the court's authority in interpreting federal law, setting precedents for a system still in its infancy. Blair's style was not flamboyant. He preferred to avoid controversy, focusing instead on building consensus among his colleagues. After only a few years, he resigned in 1795, citing poor health and perhaps a desire to retire from public life. Though his tenure was short, Blair's quiet contributions helped solidify the court's legitimacy in its earliest and most delicate stage.
James Iredell, appointed to the Supreme Court in 1790 by President George Washington, was one of the youngest justices in the court's history, taking his seat at just 38 years old. A native of England who immigrated to North Carolina as a teenager, Iredell became a staunch supporter of American independence, writing persuasive essays defending the Constitution during the ratification debates. On the bench, he quickly earned a reputation for his sharp intellect and ability to weave philosophical reasoning into legal interpretation. His most famous opinion came in Chisholm v. Georgia, 1793, where he stood as the lone dissenter, arguing that a state could not be sued by citizens of another state without its consent. Though his position was initially in the minority, it later became the law of the land with the passage of the 11th Amendment, proving his foresight. Iredell was known for his tireless work ethic, often traveling long distances to hold circuit court sessions in a young nation still defining its legal boundaries. Despite his brilliance, his time on the court was cut short when he passed away in 1799 at the age of 48. His legacy endures as that of a principled jurist whose ideas shaped the early balance between state and federal power.
William Paterson, appointed to the Supreme Court in 1793 by President George Washington, brought with him a remarkable resume as a founding father, U.S. Senator, Governor of New Jersey, and one of the framers of the Constitution. Paterson had already made his mark in American history by drafting the New Jersey Plan, a proposal that helped shape the structure of Congress during the Constitutional Convention. On the court, he was known for his practical, common-sense approach to law, grounded in his deep understanding of both state and federal systems. His tenure came during a formative period when the judiciary was still establishing its role, and Paterson played a key part in defining its authority. He heard cases involving maritime disputes, early interpretations of federal law, and questions about state sovereignty.
Patterson's style was less about lofty rhetoric and more about ensuring legal outcomes were rooted in stability and fairness, qualities that were vital in a young nation. Ill health plagued his later years, forcing him to step back from his duties in 1806, and he passed away soon after. Today, he is remembered as both a skilled statesman and a justice whose steady hand helped guide the court through its earliest challenges.
Bushrod Washington, appointed to the Supreme Court in 1798 by President John Adams, carried the legacy of his famous uncle, George Washington, but carved out his own identity as a thoughtful and influential jurist. A dedicated Federalist, Bushrod believed strongly in a robust national government and often aligned himself with Chief Justice John Marshall's vision of a powerful judiciary capable of unifying the young nation under consistent legal principles. He participated in landmark decisions that shaped the balance of power between the states and the federal government, including cases on contracts, property rights, and the scope of federal authority. Washington was known for his careful preparation and his ability to distill complex issues into clear, logical reasoning. Outside the court, he inherited Mount Vernon, where he hosted guests and maintained his uncle's estate, though his primary passion remained the law. His long tenure of over 30 years helped cement the authority of the court during its formative decades, and his steady presence provided continuity through periods of political turbulence. Though not as publicly celebrated as some of his colleagues, Bushrod Washington's influence on the early judiciary was profound, making him a cornerstone of American legal history.
Smith Thompson, appointed to the Supreme Court in 1823 by President James Monroe, brought with him a wealth of political and legal experience from his time as Secretary of the Navy and Chief Justice of the New York Supreme Court. Known for his meticulous approach and firm sense of independence, Thompson often resisted aligning too closely with the dominant opinions of Chief Justice John Marshall, instead favoring a more restrained interpretation of federal power. His judicial philosophy leaned toward preserving states' rights in areas where he felt the Constitution granted them clear authority. One of his most notable contributions came in cases involving maritime law and commerce, where his knowledge from his naval background proved invaluable. Thompson also occasionally clashed with his colleagues over the scope of the court's jurisdiction, particularly in politically sensitive disputes. Despite serving during a time when the Marshall Court was expanding federal authority, he remained consistent in voicing dissent when he believed the court overreached. His tenure lasted nearly 2 decades, during which he established a reputation as a principled jurist who valued constitutional balance over political convenience. While not as famous as some of his contemporaries, Smith Thompson's work helped ensure that the debate over state versus federal authority remained central in American legal discourse.
John McLean, appointed to the Supreme Court in 1829 by President Andrew Jackson, quickly became known as one of the most independent-minded justices in the court's history. Before joining the bench, McLean served as a congressman, postmaster general, and associate justice of the Ohio Supreme Court, giving him a rare blend of political and judicial experience. On the court, he developed a reputation for consistently following his own interpretation of the Constitution, often diverging from both his political allies and opponents. McLean is best remembered for his dissent in the landmark Dred Scott v. Sanford case of 1857, in which the majority ruled that African Americans could not be considered U.S. citizens. His powerful dissent argued that the Constitution did not deny citizenship based on race, making his position far ahead of its time and earning him admiration from abolitionists. Unusually for a justice, McLean harbored repeated ambitions for the presidency, seeking nominations from various political parties over the years, though none succeeded. His long tenure of more than 3 decades made him a key figure in many pivotal cases of the antebellum period, and his willingness to stand apart from the court's majority solidified his legacy as a principled, if sometimes politically ambitious, defender of constitutional justice.
Stephen Johnson Field, appointed by President Abraham Lincoln in 1863, became one of the longest-serving justices in Supreme Court history, holding his seat for 34 years. His appointment came at a pivotal moment during the Civil War, as Lincoln sought to ensure that the court upheld the Union's wartime measures and Reconstruction policies.
Field quickly emerged as a staunch advocate for expanding federal authority when necessary, but he was equally committed to protecting property rights and limiting government interference in the economy. This duality made him a central figure in shaping the doctrine of substantive due process, which the court would increasingly rely on in the late 19th century. Field was known for his strong opinions and his willingness to clash with both fellow justices and political leaders, including an infamous feud with Justice Samuel Miller that became legendary within legal circles. One of his most significant contributions was his opinion in Pennoyer v. Neff, 1878, which established foundational rules for jurisdiction in U.S. courts. His tenure also spanned a period of dramatic national change, from the Reconstruction era to the dawn of the Industrial Age, giving him influence over some of the most important legal transitions in American history. By the time he retired in 1897, Field had left behind a legacy of forceful jurisprudence, constitutional innovation, and personal determination that few justices have matched.
Melville Weston Fuller became Chief Justice in 1888 after being nominated by President Grover Cleveland, stepping into a role that would see him preside over one of the most transformative and controversial periods in U.S. constitutional law. A lawyer and newspaper editor before joining the court, Fuller had no prior judicial experience, yet quickly established himself as a consensus builder among the justices. His tenure is perhaps most closely associated with the court's decision in Plessy v. Ferguson, 1896, which upheld the doctrine of separate but equal and effectively legitimized racial segregation for more than half a century. While Fuller himself wrote few majority opinions in landmark cases, he shaped the court's direction through his leadership style, preferring to assign cases strategically to justices whose views aligned with his own. His court also dealt extensively with questions about the reach of federal economic regulation, often striking down laws that attempted to impose labor protections or control monopolies. Under his guidance, the court generally leaned toward laissez-faire interpretations of the Constitution, favoring property rights and limited government intervention in the economy. Critics have argued that Fuller's leadership entrenched inequalities during the Gilded Age, while supporters credit him with maintaining stability during an era of rapid industrialization. By the time he passed away in 1910, Fuller's 22-year tenure had left an indelible mark on the balance between individual liberty and governmental power, one that would be debated for decades to come.
Edward Douglas White, appointed Chief Justice in 1910 by President William Howard Taft, was the first sitting Associate Justice in U.S. history to be elevated directly to the chief position. A former Confederate soldier turned Louisiana senator and Supreme Court justice, White brought to the bench a distinctive blend of Southern political tradition and judicial pragmatism. His most notable contribution was the rule of reason doctrine in antitrust law, articulated in Standard Oil Company of New Jersey versus the United States, 1911. This ruling acknowledged that not all monopolies were inherently illegal, only those that unreasonably restrained trade, marking a shift from the more rigid enforcement approach of earlier antitrust decisions. White also presided over important cases on the scope of federal power, including challenges to the income tax and wartime measures during World War I. His court generally supported federal authority when it came to national defense or economic stability, yet maintained a cautious approach toward expanding government control over everyday commerce. A man of complex loyalties, White defended the Constitution's adaptability while still holding conservative views on social and racial issues. Colleagues often described him as deliberate and soft-spoken, with a knack for forging compromises in contentious cases. His tenure, lasting until his passing in 1921, bridged the Gilded Age's laissez-faire legal mindset with the growing demands of a modern industrial state, setting the stage for more assertive federal regulation in the decades to follow.
William Howard Taft, appointed Chief Justice in 1921 by President Warren G. Harding, remains the only person in U.S. history to have served both as President and Chief Justice. For Taft, the Supreme Court role was his true ambition. He famously remarked that he preferred it over the presidency.
His tenure was defined by administrative reforms that modernized the court, including securing funding for the construction of the U.S. Supreme Court building, ensuring the judiciary had its own home separate from the Capitol. Taft was a strong advocate for judicial efficiency and successfully pushed for the Judiciary Act of 1925, which gave the court greater control over its docket, allowing justices to focus on significant constitutional questions rather than being overwhelmed by routine appeals. In terms of jurisprudence, Taft leaned toward a conservative interpretation of the Constitution, often favoring limited government intervention in the economy while supporting broad federal authority in matters of commerce and interstate regulation. He also authored key opinions on presidential powers, labor disputes, and the limits of administrative agencies. Known for his meticulous legal reasoning and administrative skill, Taft worked to strengthen the judiciary's independence from political influence. Despite bouts of ill health, he remained deeply engaged with the court's work until shortly before his passing in 1930. His legacy endures not only in landmark rulings, but also in the institutional foundation he built, which continues to define the court's operations today.
Harlan F. Stone, appointed Chief Justice in 1941 by President Franklin D. Roosevelt, guided the court through the turbulent years of World War II and the early Cold War. Before his elevation, Stone had served as Attorney General and Associate Justice, earning a reputation for integrity and intellectual rigor. His tenure as Chief Justice was marked by a strong emphasis on judicial restraint and a belief in the court's role as an impartial arbiter rather than a driver of social change. Stone presided over landmark cases that tested constitutional limits during wartime, including Korematsu v. United States, 1944, which controversially upheld the internment of Japanese Americans, an opinion that has since been widely criticized but reflected the era's security anxieties. He also oversaw decisions that expanded federal authority in economic regulation, continuing the shift away from the restrictive interpretations of earlier decades. Known for his administrative competence, Stone sought to keep the court above partisan politics and emphasize the importance of clear, narrowly tailored rulings. He valued efficiency and clarity in judicial writing, encouraging justices to focus on practical legal outcomes rather than grand philosophical statements. Though often quiet in demeanor, Stone had a firm hand in guiding the court's internal deliberations, maintaining unity where possible despite ideological divides. His sudden passing in 1946, while still in office, brought an abrupt end to a career defined by dedication to the stability and credibility of the judiciary during one of the most volatile periods in modern American history.
Fred M. Vinson, appointed Chief Justice in 1946 by President Harry S. Truman, stepped into the role during a nation transitioning from wartime unity to Cold War tension. A seasoned politician, former congressman, and Treasury Secretary, Vinson brought a pragmatic, consensus-driven approach to the court. His tenure was defined by efforts to mend divisions among the justices after the ideological clashes of the 1930s and early 40s. While he lacked the sweeping legal philosophy of some predecessors, Vinson excelled at building coalitions, often aiming for unanimous or near-unanimous decisions to project institutional stability. He presided over pivotal cases on labor rights, antitrust regulation, and the early constitutional questions raised by the Cold War, including loyalty oaths and restrictions on suspected subversives. His leadership was tested in the lead-up to Brown v. Board of Education 1954, as the court wrestled with the constitutionality of racial segregation in public schools. Vinson leaned toward a gradualist approach, concerned about potential backlash, but his unexpected passing in 1953 meant he never saw the landmark ruling. Truman once described Vinson as the strongest Chief Justice since John Marshall, reflecting his trust in Vinson's ability to keep the judiciary aligned during politically sensitive times. Though critics argued that his tenure lacked transformative jurisprudence, supporters emphasized that he restored collegiality to a court still healing from internal rifts. Vinson's years on the bench were marked by a commitment to moderation, institutional unity, and steady judicial leadership during the uncertain first years of the Cold War.
Earl Warren, appointed Chief Justice in 1953 by President Dwight D. Eisenhower, transformed the Supreme Court into a force for sweeping social change. A former governor of California with a reputation for political skill and moral conviction, Warren had little prior judicial experience, yet quickly proved adept at guiding the court toward bold, unanimous decisions in landmark cases. His tenure began with Brown v. Board of Education, 1954, in which the court declared racial segregation in public schools unconstitutional, a decision Warren skillfully unified the justices behind to present a united front. Over the next 16 years, the Warren Court reshaped American law in ways that expanded civil rights, reinforced the rights of the accused, and strengthened the constitutional guarantees of free speech and religious freedom. Landmark rulings such as Gideon v. Wainwright, 1963, ensuring the right to counsel, Miranda v. Arizona, 1966, requiring police to inform suspects of their rights, and Reynolds v. Sims, 1964, establishing the principle of one person, one vote, reflected the court's commitment to equality and fairness. Warren was also a key figure beyond the judiciary, heading the commission that investigated President John F. Kennedy's assassination. Critics accused the court of overstepping its authority and engaging in judicial activism, but supporters saw Warren as a champion of justice whose leadership modernized constitutional interpretation for a rapidly changing society. By the time he retired in 1969, Warren had cemented his legacy as one of the most influential Chief Justices in U.S. history, leaving behind a court that had profoundly expanded the meaning of liberty and equality in American life.
Warren E. Burger, appointed Chief Justice in 1969 by President Richard Nixon, arrived with a promise to steer the Supreme Court toward a more conservative path after the liberal activism of the Warren era. A Minnesota-born jurist known for his administrative skills and plain-spoken manner, Burger sought to restore what he saw as judicial restraint. Yet, despite Nixon's intentions, the Burger Court often issued decisions that maintained or even expanded on the Warren Court's precedents. Under Burger, the court delivered Roe v. Wade, 1973, which recognized a constitutional right to privacy encompassing a woman's choice in matters of pregnancy, a landmark ruling that would define national debate for decades. His tenure also oversaw United States v. Nixon, 1974, a unanimous decision compelling President Nixon to release the Watergate tapes, cementing the principle that no one, not even the president, is above the law. In the realm of education, Swan v. Charlotte Mecklenburg Board of Education, 1971, endorsed busing as a tool to achieve desegregation, while Furman v. Georgia, 1972, effectively halted the death penalty for several years until states revised their procedures. Burger's leadership style was sometimes criticized as inefficient, with some justices frustrated by his tendency to reassign opinions and his reluctance to allow consensus to form naturally. Nonetheless, he presided over a historic legal transitions where the court both pushed back against and carried forward the progressive momentum of the 1960s. Retiring in 1986, Burger left a legacy as a pragmatic leader whose court navigated a politically divided America and delivered decisions that still shape the nation's legal and political debates today.
William Rehnquist's path to becoming Chief Justice in 1986 was shaped by his earlier role as one of the most consistently conservative voices on the court. Appointed as an Associate Justice by President Richard Nixon in 1972, Rehnquist had already built a reputation for favoring states' rights, limiting federal power, and applying a strict reading of the Constitution. As Chief Justice, appointed by President Ronald Reagan, he led the court for nearly 2 decades, becoming one of the longest serving in that role. Under his leadership, the court shifted toward a more restrained interpretation of federal authority, often siding with states in disputes over Washington's reach. In decisions like United States v. Lopez, 1995, the court struck down a federal law banning guns near schools, signaling limits on Congress's use of the Commerce Clause. Yet Rehnquist was not purely ideological. He sometimes surprised observers, such as in Planned Parenthood v. Casey, 1992, where the court reaffirmed the core of Roe v. Wade.
He also presided over Bush v. Gore 2000, the highly controversial decision that effectively resolved the presidential election in George W. Bush's favor, a ruling that remains one of the most politically charged moments in Supreme Court history. Known for his efficiency and no-nonsense approach, Rehnquist improved the court's operations while maintaining a steady, often understated public presence. His tenure left a clear imprint on constitutional law, reinforcing federalism and a more limited view of judicial intervention, shaping the legal landscape well into the 21st century.
John Roberts became Chief Justice in 2005, appointed by President George W. Bush after the passing of William Rehnquist. At just 50 years old, he was one of the youngest to ever hold the position, bringing a reputation for sharp legal intellect, a calm demeanor, and a desire to reduce the public perception of the court as politically divided. Roberts often described his role as that of an umpire, calling balls and strikes without making the rules, yet his tenure has been defined by careful, strategic decisions that sometimes defy simple partisan labels. Early in his leadership, he steered the court toward greater consensus and narrow rulings, but over time, it presided over some of the most consequential cases in modern history. In National Federation of Independent Business versus Sebelius, 2012, Roberts cast the decisive vote to uphold the Affordable Care Act's individual mandate, interpreting it as a tax, a surprising move for a conservative justice, and one that sparked debate about his judicial philosophy. At the same time, he authored decisions like Shelby County versus Holder, 2013, which struck down key parts of the Voting Rights Act, signaling a shift in how the court viewed federal oversight of state election laws. Roberts also played a pivotal role in high-profile cases on same-sex marriage, campaign finance, and executive power. Known for his meticulous questioning during oral arguments and his emphasis on institutional legitimacy, Roberts has sought to shield the court from being seen as an extension of partisan politics, even as the ideological battles within it have grown sharper. His tenure continues to shape how the court navigates a deeply divided political climate.
Elena Kagan joined the Supreme Court in 2010, appointed by President Barack Obama to replace Justice John Paul Stevens. Without prior judicial experience, she had served as Solicitor General and Dean of Harvard Law School. Kagan brought a reputation for intellectual rigor, sharp wit, and a talent for building coalitions. Her confirmation hearings showcased her skill in navigating political questions with humor and precision, earning her bipartisan respect even in a polarized era. On the court, Kagan quickly became known for her clear, accessible writing style and her ability to frame arguments in ways that resonate beyond legal circles. She has been a consistent voice in favor of civil rights protections, voting access, and robust government regulatory powers. In cases like Arizona State Legislature versus Arizona Independent Redistricting Commission, 2015, she wrote for the majority in upholding the use of independent commissions to draw congressional districts, defending them as a safeguard against partisan gerrymandering. Kagan has also been influential in dissent, using compelling, sometimes conversational prose to highlight the stakes of controversial decisions, particularly in voting rights, environmental law, and separation of powers disputes. Her background as a skilled consensus builder often places her in the role of moderating opinions, finding common ground where possible, while firmly articulating her views when consensus is out of reach. Outside the courtroom, she is known for her engaging personality, love of sports, and commitment to mentoring younger lawyers. Over time, Kagan's combination of strategic pragmatism and principled reasoning has made her a central figure in the court's liberal bloc, with her influence likely to grow in shaping its future direction.
Ketanji Brown Jackson became the first black woman to serve on the U.S. Supreme Court when she was appointed by President Joe Biden in 2022, succeeding Justice Stephen Breyer. Her confirmation was a historic milestone, marking both a symbolic and substantive shift in the court's composition. Before joining the court, Jackson served as a federal district judge and later on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit, earning respect for her meticulous legal reasoning and deep understanding of constitutional law. She also worked as a public defender, the first justice in modern history with significant criminal defense experience, bringing a perspective to the bench shaped by direct engagement with the rights of the accused. During her confirmation hearings, Jackson's calm demeanor and careful explanation stood out as she navigated pointed questioning while remaining composed and precise. On the court, she quickly established herself as an active participant in oral arguments, asking detailed, historically grounded questions and often seeking clarity on the real-world implications of legal disputes. Her early opinions and dissents have reflected a commitment to individual rights, procedural fairness, and judicial transparency. Jackson's presence also carries symbolic weight for underrepresented communities, signaling a broader and more inclusive vision of the American judiciary. While still at the beginning of her tenure, her combination of sharp legal analysis, practical trial-level experience, and a willingness to engage deeply with complex issues suggests she will play a significant role in shaping the court's jurisprudence for decades to come.